Today's Life Matters show is part of our educational work. Our guest today is Ann Glendnon, the learned hand professor at Harvard Law School, who has written many books on life and family issues. She is the first woman president of the Pope's Academy of Social Science, the Pope's think tank for social sciences, and the head of the Vatican delegation to the UN Women's Conference that was held in China, and has been a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. If the audience has any questions for our guest, the number is 617-973-4848. If your calls are blocked, type *82. Welcome to Life Matters, Professor Glendon.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Now, you have a lot of accomplishments that you've done with pro-life and family issues, but I want to back up to your first activism that I know of, which was working on civil rights in the 60s. And a lot of our audience wasn't even born in the 60s. Maybe you could explain what you were doing.
Well, I'd have to start in western Massachusetts, which is where I grew up. And in 1963, some of your listeners will remember there was a great march on Washington, and Martin Luther King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And my sister and I went on a bus from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, down to Washington, and we were energized by that movement, which at the time had a very definite Christian inspiration. A year later, when I was practicing law in Chicago, that was Freedom Summer, 1964, and I took my law firm vacation and went down and defended civil rights workers.
So you made a transition after doing the voter registration and civil rights work that summer. You went and later on made a transition to doing pro-life work. And how did you make that transition and yet others didn't?
You know, it seemed to me so obvious that there was a seamlessness between the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the pro-life movement that took rise in the 1970s. And I've often puzzled about why so many people who were active in the first movement didn't make the transition to the second movement. I think part of the reason is that somewhere along the line, activists in the civil rights movement dropped off the Christianity that Martin Luther King had represented. And another reason is they just didn't seem to be able to see that what the two movements had in common was a concern for who is to be included in the human community.
So later on, you wrote this book, Rights Talk, and it was something about how the people discuss rights, the rights and legal concepts are deep in our society. But how did that work rightly and wrongly in these issues?
Looking back on it as a lawyer, I think it is unfortunate that the discussion about abortion in our society got cabined in the framework of a clash of rights. Theologically, one might say one doesn't have a right to life. Life is a gift, and it's a gift that comes with certain responsibilities. But once we started talking about these things in the rights framework, and we got some Supreme Court decisions about the right of privacy, we found ourselves, in the pro-life movement, we found ourselves facing the most absolute right that our legal system has ever recognized. It's interesting that in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court did not dare to speak of a right to abortion. They didn't talk about a right to abortion until several years later. And I think the reason for that is it simply would have been shocking to the American public in the early 1970s to be told that abortion was a right.
So they didn't use the word right to abortion, or they said right to privacy. And I think, are most people aware of really what the decisions Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, what they really made legal?
I am positive that even today most people do not realize how these two decisions, when you put them together, in effect issued an unrestricted license to abort an unborn human child from the very beginning of pregnancy right up to the end of the 9th month, and even up to the process of being born in the partial birth abortion situation.
So what advice do you have for women who they've gone through an abortion, maybe they realized what the development of their child was, or maybe they didn't? What advice would you have?
Well, fortunately, we have wonderful organizations like Project Rachel that women can call and talk it out. You're right. Many women didn't realize, were not well informed about what was involved, especially in the early days. And many women are carrying around with them, as they know more and more, they're carrying around with this a tremendous burden of grief and guilt. And Project Rachel has been very helpful in being available for women in that situation.
Weren't there some recent decisions by the Supreme Court that talked in more detail about what abortion really is?
Well, we have the recent decisions involving the gruesome procedure known as partial birth abortion, and we won't describe it in detail, but one of the things that I find when I discuss this issue with people, very well-educated people, is they can't quite wrap their minds around the fact that the Supreme Court does permit abortion right up until the end of the 9th month. And this partial birth abortion procedure, now we are beginning to get decisions that will limit it. But people are reluctant to believe that such a thing happens or that the law could ever condone it.
Now, you wrote this book, Abortion and Divorce in Western Law. How do abortion and divorce work together, and even aside from divorce, non-marriage, avoiding marriage completely? How is that all part of a social interaction?
That's a big question, but since I've lived so long now and can look back on the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it seems to me that our country went through an enormous social experiment. We embarked on a social experiment, let's call it the sexual revolution, most people do, without recognizing the consequences of the increase in divorce, the increase in abortion, the anything goes attitude toward human sexuality. And it really was a long time before the bill started to come in, and we began to realize that there were consequences, there was the price to be paid, and that the price was paid not only by the people who engaged in the revolution, not only by the revolutionaries, but by their children. And I really think, as an educator, I really think that the children of the sexual revolutionaries want something different for themselves.
You are, as you said, an educator. You see at Harvard privileged young people and people who got there by their gift of intelligence. What do you see in your students as 30 years into the sexual revolution? What do you see as the outcome for their lives?
I think these young men and women are, many of them come from broken homes, feel distressed and wounded by the experiences they've had, and are puzzled about exactly how to have a different life. They know they want something better for themselves, but they don't know, they're not quite sure how to do it, because in many cases they haven't seen a model of a couple acting together to work through differences. Many of them have never seen what a father does.
So marriage is changing legally with same-sex marriage, and it's changing with, as you've studied and written about, divorce, and it's changing by people who don't want to get married. Why is